benchmark here in Canada. Coronavirus infections are rising in two of the biggest provinces. Ontario reporting 169 new infections today. In Quebec, there are 175 new cases and 2 deaths being reported. This is the largest single-day increase in both provinces since late July. Meantime, Canadian women's shelters are preparing for a second wave of COVID-19. Earlier this week, StatsCan released new numbers that show a 12% spike in domestic disturbance calls compared to last year. Gael Fidida is with Women's Shelters Canada in Montreal.
So during the pandemic, you're locked down with your aggressor, basically. You're not going out to your work or anything. So it's like really a boiling pot in the flat.
Internationally, in Iran, schools have reopened for the first time since the start of the pandemic, despite strong objections from that country's medical council. It is warning that 15 million Iranian students attending in-person classes could create a catastrophe. But Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says education must go ahead.
We did not shut down education during the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war. We did not close education during the hard days of the bombing of cities, and despite all difficulties, our students continued their education at schools.
COVID-19 outbreak in Iran is the worst in the Middle East, with close to 400,000 infections and more than 22,000 deaths. Next to the United Kingdom. Supporters cheer as protesters with Extinction Rebellion are led away by police this morning. The environmental activists delayed distribution of several national newspapers by blocking access to at least 3 printing presses owned by Rupert Murdoch. More than 100 protesters obstructed roads. Some chained themselves to structures. There were at least 70 arrests. Extinction Rebellion accuses the Murdoch papers of failing to report on climate change. Japanese are bracing for another dangerously powerful typhoon this weekend. It follows another storm this week that killed 2 people on the Korean peninsula and injured dozens more. Ithel Musa reports.
First, it was Typhoon Mayzak. That storm brought torrents of rain to southern Japan before making landfall in South Korea on Thursday. It injured dozens of people and cut power to thousands of homes. Now the country is preparing for Haishin, which could be the most powerful typhoon the country has experienced in decades. Right now, it's threatening the country's southwest region, and it's expected to intensify as it nears the southern islands of Okinawa and Amami early tomorrow. Japan's weather agency says the typhoon is packing maximum wind gusts of up to 252 kilometers per hour. Officials are warning people in affected areas to be ready for tremendous damage, and they're urging them to take shelter in a safe place before the typhoon lands. Ithel Musa, CBC News, Toronto.
Voters in New Brunswick casting ballots today as the first of 2 advance polls open ahead of the September 14th provincial election in New Brunswick. It's the first election to be held in Canada since the start of the pandemic. Elections New Brunswick has been encouraging people to vote at the returning offices and with mail-in ballots in an effort to reduce the size of crowds on Election Day. And one of the more high-profile pandemic concerts getting underway in Prince Edward County this weekend. Hamilton rock couple Whitehorse, one of the bands playing the Golden Hour 2020 festival in Picton. This is downtown from their album Leave No Bridge Unburned. The Sadies and Annalise Nerona also playing today. It's happening at the Mustang Drive-In Theater in Picton. Up to 150 vehicles will be pulling in. Distance, of course, for a day of Canadian music. That is the world this hour from CBC News. I'm Kenny Sharp.
From CTV News at 1:46 p.m. today.
Hello, I'm Angie Seth from the CTV Newsroom in Toronto. Here are your top stories. Police say a Friday morning shooting in Oshawa, Ontario that left 5 people dead, including the gunman, was a tragic family affair. Investigators say 48-year-old Mitchell Lapa of Winnipeg was the sole shooter, and the 4 people killed, along with the lone survivor, were all members of the same family. There's growing anger and unrest over the death of Daniel Prude, a black man who died while in police custody in Rochester, New York, back in March. Last night, protesters clashed with police and officers used tear gas to break up the crowd. 8 people were arrested. 2 officers were also injured. Meantime, U.S. President Donald Trump denying reports he mocked fallen U.S. soldiers. It comes after The Atlantic magazine published an article saying Trump called them, quote, losers after canceling a trip to a military cemetery in France back in 2018. Here at home, Canada's top doctor is making a public plea ahead of the long weekend, reminding Canadians to follow pandemic protocols as colder weather moves gatherings indoors. After a thrilling Game 3 win, the Raptors are looking to even up the series against the Boston Celtics. This afternoon, Game 4 tips off in the Orlando bubble at 6:30 Eastern, 3:30 Pacific. Well, for all the day's top stories and breaking news as it happens, tune to CTV News channel and go online to ctvnews.ca. I'm Angie Seth.
From CNBC Tech Check at 4:23 p.m. yesterday.
I'm Josh Lipton, and here's your CNBC Tech Check. Tech's tumble continues. Apple, the world's most valuable company, is on pace for its 3rd straight down day. That would be its longest losing streak since March. The iPhone maker has now shed more than $200 billion in market cap in just over the past 2 days. That steep drop is bigger than the value of American heavyweights like Nike, McDonald's, Exxon, and Pepsi. It's not just Apple, though. Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft are under pressure again today, too. And in Thursday's market sell-off, Amazon closed down more than 4%, taking $9 billion off of CEO Jeff Bezos' net worth. Meanwhile, Amazon is on a hiring spree in its hometown. The e-commerce giant said it plans to bring on 10,000 employees in the Seattle suburb of Bellevue over the next few years. That's on top of 15,000 jobs it already plans to create there. To house the employees, Amazon has secured an additional 2 million square feet of office space in downtown Bellevue. The suburb is located just across Lake Washington from Amazon's headquarters in Seattle. An e-cigarette maker, Juul, is planning to lay off more than half of the 2,200-person workforce. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, citing people familiar with the matter. Juul is also reportedly considering halting sales across Europe and Asia. That could result in Juul pulling out of 11 countries, narrowing its operations to just the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. Juul had previously announced plans to cut workers, but hadn't specified how many. That's all from the West Coast. We'll see you back here next week.
From DW News Brief at 8 a.m. today.
This is DW News, and these are our top stories. Health authorities in India say the country has now exceeded 4 million coronavirus cases. India has the 3rd highest total worldwide behind the U.S. and Brazil. Even so, restrictions have been eased as the Indian government pushes to open up the economy. Only the worst-hit areas are still under lockdown. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier says Germany should consider an official memorial ceremony for victims of COVID-19. He said many relatives of people who died did not get to see their loved ones because of quarantine precautions. Germany has fared better than many nations in the pandemic, but more than 9,000 people have died. Police in the Australian city of Melbourne have made a number of arrests at a protest against measures to stop the coronavirus. Several hundred people gathered at the rally. The measures, including a curfew, were put in place after a spike in infections in Melbourne and the state of Victoria. This is DW News from Berlin. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at DW News or visit our website, dw.com.
From Bloomberg First Word at 6:19 a.m. yesterday.
Republicans and Democrats have agreed on one thing. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are working to avoid a government shutdown right before the election. They won't let the stalemate over virus relief legislation hold up a vital stopgap spending bill that clears the way for the government to stay in operation at the start of the new fiscal year. Meanwhile, President Trump has denied a magazine account that he disparaged America's war dead as losers. According to The Atlantic, the president tried to get out of a visit to the graves of American Marines killed in World War I in France. He reportedly said, quote, "Why should I go to that cemetery? It's filled with losers." The president calls the account a total lie. And the suspect in the shooting of a right-wing activist in Portland, Oregon last week has been killed. Federal authorities say they were trying to take Michael Reinhold into custody when officers shot him. Reinhold was a vocal supporter of the far-left Antifa movement. And the U.S. labor market probably saw a fourth month of improvement in August, but chances of further outside gains are diminishing without the stimulus payments. The monthly jobs report is out at 8:30 New York time this morning. Economists project the unemployment rate dropped below 10% for the first time since March. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg.
We are looking at another day of extreme volatility, and this week alone, stocks have now wiped out nearly $3.5 trillion in value.
Wall Street is about to close any minute now. The Dow collapsing around 1,900 points today. Its worst single-day loss ever.
Stocks move back to lows for the day toward the close as President Trump said coronavirus may be an issue through July or August. Now,
the stock market, like every other part of American life, took a turn for the worse. But then, a few weeks later, the stock market started to reverse those losses. And things started to get good.
The markets closed lower Friday, but all three major indexes posted double-digit gains last month.
And then things started to get really good.
Wall Street continued its upward climb to record heights Friday, with technology's outsized performance leading the way.
And things have gotten to the point where, for at least some people out there, the stock market's never been better.
Apple above $467.77, making it a $2 trillion market cap.
What a week for Tesla. Shares are up a staggering 26% this week.
Jeff Bezos, just yesterday, made $13 billion.
But a lot of people seem to be confused. We've had listeners write to us asking, businesses all over my city are shutting down, the economy is a mess, why is the stock market surging? And of course, on the day we decide to make an episode about it, the stock market appears to be taking a dip, but the trend is certainly upwards, and that's a trend Emily Stewart has been writing about for Vox.
Your Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, which is the parent company for that, is Alphabet. They've all been doing spectacularly this year. And then the major stock indexes. You hear Trump talk about the Dow Jones Industrial Average a lot. And the Dow is above 28,000. That's a big number. I mean, thinking that when Trump became president, I remember sitting at my old job in my old office joking about when the Dow was going to pass 20,000. And now we're at 28,000. The stock market is really, really going up.
But why? I know my dude Kai Rizdal would say
the stock market is not the same thing as the economy. And I think we're really seeing this great disconnect. We never know exactly why the market does what it does, but there are a few things that have happened. One thing that happened back in March is that the Federal Reserve, the central bank for the United States, took some really big measures that really propped up markets.
The Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates today amid fears about the coronavirus outbreak.
They started buying a bunch of securities.
The Fed, first of all, saying that it will purchase treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, quote, in the amount needed. Call that open-ended QE.
In a way that really put some money and some liquidity into the market and really kind of staved off what could have been a financial meltdown. At the same time, like I said before, tech stocks have done really, really well, and big tech stocks. And so when you look at something like the S&P 500, if you got rid of the big tech stocks, the S&P wouldn't be doing that great. some people will tell you that the stock market right now is doing well because it's supposed to be a leading indicator, which means the stock market is supposed to start to move before the economy. And so if you think the stock market is doing well now because the economy is going to do well in the future, then this makes sense to you. Do I think that the economy remarkably in 6 months, 3 months is going to be doing awesome? No. But that's sort of the take that we're having right now, at least from some corners that say the stock market is indicating that the economy is going to get a lot better.
Okay, so tech stocks have been sort of leading the charge because tech companies have been doing really well during the pandemic. Investors have confidence in the future of this country. The interest rates are super low, and the Fed is buying a bunch of bonds. You've mentioned Donald Trump a few times. How much credit does the president really deserve here?
Donald Trump, when the stock market's doing well, would like you to think that it is all attributable to him. And when the stock market's not doing well, it has nothing to do with him. But he really has tied his presidency to the stock market.
It's always nice to begin by saying the stock market is up again. We just set another record. We have another big record stock market day and another record in the stock market in the history of our country, which to me means jobs. We just hit the highest number in the history of the stock market.
How much of it has to do with him? Some of it does. Trump has had very market-friendly policies. Back in 2017, he signed that giant tax cut bill that was really great for rich people and for corporations. He has been good for the stock market now. Has he been the only reason the stocks are doing anything? Of course not. Part of it is, yes, politics. Part of it is market-friendly policies. But it's also the day-to-day headlines. Apple has really good earnings. That's good for the company. Ultimately, stock prices are supposed to be tied to future expectations of earnings for a company. So stocks move for a variety of reasons. Trump has given investors reason to be confident, but he's not the only reason that the market moves in any given moment.
We've been hearing President Trump take credit for the stock market for 4 years, but strangely at the Republican National Convention, it didn't seem to be one of his biggest talking points.
Going into the convention, I assumed they're going to try and find a way to get the Dow personified on stage. And then it just wasn't really there. He talked about it on Monday after the roll call for a little bit, and then during his acceptance speech for the nomination, he kind of name-checked the market and then moved on.
Take a look at what's happening with the markets. Take a look at your 401ks, which you probably do every hour. Take a look at your stocks. We're very close to breaking the record, and NASDAQ has already done it. NASDAQ has broken the record, I think, 16 times already.
If I had to take a guess, it's not quite the vision that Republicans wanted of their party, whether or not it's actually what they value. When you watch the Republican convention, it seemed like what they wanted to talk about more was how Donald Trump is not racist. Also, crime is on the rise. It just wasn't high on the agenda.
Right. We touched on this in our RNC recap episode last Friday. Clearly, the game plan was to try and chip away at black voters and women who are inclined to vote for Biden. Are those black voters and women not day trading, though? How many Americans are invested in the stock market?
Well, if you look at the statistics, a small majority of Americans have money in the stock market. Now, does that mean that they have a giant stock portfolio or that they're day trading? No, but a lot of people do have money in a 401k, a pension, things like that. And there are a lot of ordinary people who are investing in stocks right now. With apps like Robinhood, which right now is kind of the hot app where all of these day traders are flocking to. A lot of people also have been really bored in quarantine and have been playing in the market and investing. And, there's an argument that the market should not only be for the wealthy, that ordinary people should be accessing it and should have the opportunity to access it, understanding what the risk is. So, yes, there is a benefit for a lot of people, but, there's a difference between my Apple stock went up and, hey, I don't have a paycheck. In the long term, the economy will improve. I think what's happening right now is the market seems to indicate that that the economy is going to improve pretty quickly. I would argue that part of that is an assumption that Congress will do more in terms of fiscal stimulus, a follow-up to the CARES Act that President Trump signed into law back in March. That's a pretty big assumption, but maybe the market will be right.
After the break, all those people who can't afford to play the market because they're unemployed and living benefit check to benefit check. Where is that stimulus? I'm Sean Rameswaram. It's Today Explained. Support for the hosts, your producer, down, crisis.
What if it isn't? Which should...
I think it's possible these days when it comes to...
changes as we get more information. Memories can be pretty cock.
Wow, and then it just kind of disappeared off the radar. What happened to it?
Nothing, really.
Oh, is that why it disappeared off the radar?
Yeah, I mean, the word that people have been using to talk about stimulus negotiations has just been stalemate.
Would you be willing to call my speaker and say you want to go back to the negotiating table today?
Can I tell her that you suggested I call her right after the hearing?
Yes.
Done. I will call her right after the hearing. Thank you, Chairwoman.
There was recently a call between Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but for the most part, Congress has been on summer recess, and in that time, we've had the conventions, the presidential race has heated up, and congressional leaders and White House officials haven't really been talking that much about coronavirus stimulus.
And you mentioned that the Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, had a call with Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. What did they talk about? Do we know?
They talked about where Republicans and Democrats are at and how much money either side would be willing to spend. Democrats passed a $3 trillion bill way back in May, and Pelosi issued a statement, saying that Democrats are willing to go down to $2.2 trillion, but that is like their final threshold. Republicans right now are going between, passing a $1 trillion bill or a $1.5 trillion bill, but they don't want to go any higher than that. So basically, Pelosi said this phone call made it clear that Democrats in the White House still have this huge gap between where they are on this bill. She's saying we're already trying to reach a compromise, and our compromise even is too much for Republicans to negotiate on.
So the thing they're fighting about now is the thing they're fighting about a month ago, which is just how much money to spend on this thing?
Yeah, it's how much to spend, but I also think something that they disagree on is where to spend the money and who to give it to. Republicans are focused on passing, another round of small business loans because that's a program that was pretty popular in their conference.
$500 billion total dollars in the PPP program, 5 million loans you made that helped 85% of the small businesses around this country, 51 million jobs.
Democrats are really focused on passing a lot of money for state and local governments.
The state governments are being forced to cannibalize their rainy day funds. They're cutting essential services, and they're laying off workers. According to the Department of Labor, 1.5 million state and local government workers have lost their jobs since February.
Many of them have been spending a lot to sort of combat coronavirus in their individual states, because we should note that President Donald Trump has kind of foisted federal responsibility for a lot of this stuff onto the states. So throughout the spring and summer, states have been spending money, trying to do testing, trying to pay their portion of unemployment insurance, trying to get schools back. So these state governments and local governments have been spending a lot of money without much aid from the feds, and it's really unclear if they're going to get any of that aid quickly.
Is it dead, or is it just stalled?
It's not dead, and Congress is going to come back on September 8th next week to go back into session. And so one would assume that talks would start then, or hopefully before then. But yeah, I think that the ideal scenario is that leadership would have hammered out a deal before Congress goes back so that they have something, ready to vote on. And we should note here that the enhanced unemployment benefits have been expired for a while. You know, there are a lot of people that are really struggling to pay the bills. There have been some executive orders on, you know, moratoriums on evictions and things like that. But all in all, Congress has not appropriated new money. And at this point, Democrats and Republicans cannot agree on a number.
Are they just going to call it at some point and be like, hey, we couldn't reach a deal, it's over, we're not even going to talk about it anymore, there's an election coming, we've got other things to think about?
Well, the thing that I'm wondering is, so Senate Republicans are supposed to go back on the 8th as well. And from recent reporting, it sounds like what McConnell is going to do is going to try to force a vote on an even smaller bill, a $500 billion bill, which, of course, you know, Democrats say is not nearly enough for the purposes of what is needed. So I think that there's sort of going to be, you know, some trying to force a vote tactics. This will fail. Republicans will accuse Democrats of stalling, which, you know, maybe will help them in an election year. But yeah, I mean, I think maybe the thing that will spur people to do something is like if their poll numbers get really bad.
And they haven't yet?
Well, the whole dynamic with Senate races this year has been that Republicans had been worried about Trump's approval rating and Trump's status in polls, and especially in battleground state polls. That's what they're looking at.
Joe Biden now leading President Trump in all 6 battleground states.
And for a lot of vulnerable senators like Susan Collins of Maine, you know, the Paycheck Protection Act and stuff that they did in the last coronavirus package is a big part of their argument for re-election. So right now, battleground polls between Biden and Trump appear to be tightening a little bit. Republicans are feeling like they are a little bit more competitive than they were maybe in late spring, early summer. And so right now, I feel like, you know, there might sort of be this idea of we can blame the Democrats for this. We can kind of buy ourselves a little bit of time. But that also might just make all of this worse, and all of this worse for both Republicans and Democrats in the long run.
Could the president take some more executive action? I know he did 3 or 4 things about a month ago.
The president restoring unemployment benefits, minimizing evictions, suspending interest on student loans, and enacting payroll tax cuts.
Could he do more now?
At the end of the day, Congress is the body that appropriates money. Trump can't just conjure money out of thin air. You know, he can sort of direct where it goes through the federal government, but Congress is the one that has to appropriate new funding. And so without this new funding, and especially as we're going into winter, where, you know, people are already going back to school. We're already seeing cases spike, especially at colleges and universities. Outdoor dining that we've had that sort of kept restaurants afloat is going to have to move indoor for winter. There are all these other things that are happening. You know, flu season's going to happen. So, you know, to just baseline, like not approving money to even just prepare for the next few months is concerning. But at this point, you know, they're trying to get money approved to sort of like clean up the mess of the summer. So strategically, that puts you way behind, you know, when the U.S. is sort of trying to deal still with this big crisis that isn't going away. In a way, the economic crisis has sort of had a cushion because Congress had passed this $2 trillion CARES Act back in March that had the expanded unemployment insurance, the $600 a week. And so a lot of people were able to kind of exist on that. It was actually, you know, a boost to some people's wages. So the economic fallout hasn't been as bad because Congress acted quickly and decisively and passed this $2 trillion bill back in March. But because we now have this, you know, months-long lag where there's no new money being passed, I think that the economic fallout could be much worse down the line.
I'm Avery Trufelman, and I'm the new host of The Cut podcast from New York Magazine and the Vox Media Podcast Network. Every Wednesday, the Cut editorial team and I will explore surprising, provocative ideas about style, self, culture, and power. In our first episode, we're looking at what it means to be optimistic in 2020. You can listen and subscribe to The Cut now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
Fucking bee. Or wasp, sorry. Guys, we did it. We listened to the news, Today Explained, and did some yoga, and we did it all while... Hi, sorry, this bee is distracting as fuck. All we need now is an affirmation. To go and pick, portion, and prepare some veggies for work, or not to pick, portion, and prepare some veggies for work. Yeah. Noodle, don't noodle. You're too worried about what once was and not what will be. However, there's a saying, yesterday's history, tomorrow's a mystery, but today is a gift. That's why we call it the present. Guys, thank you so much for joining. I hope y'all have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time on another great episode of All While High.